Welcome to our virtual panel on radical movements in the village and the battle over free speech. I'm Juan Rivero, Special Projects Director at Village Preservation. Let me start with a few words of introduction. Village Preservation is a neighborhood preservation organization focused on Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. Since 1980, we have been documenting and celebrating these neighborhoods, fighting to stop inappropriate development in them while encouraging appropriate development and advocating on behalf of their cultural institutions and independent small businesses. In addition, we host about 75 free programs per year, like this one. Our events cover a wide range of topics related to the history, architecture, culture, and development of our neighborhoods. Right now, and for just a few days more, we have the public art installation Village Voices on display in 24 scattered sites, and you should check them out. They're great. Additionally, next month, we're hosting another panel dealing with radical movements in the village. That one will focus on the struggle for reproductive rights. We are a member-based organization, so your support is essential to our capacity to provide this free programming and continue our advocacy and preservation work. If you like what we do, consider joining us or making a donation at villagepreservation.org. Tonight, our distinguished panelists will be discussing various strands in the history of radical social movements in the village, the relation of those movements to the battle over free speech, and the relevance of this story to contemporary debates and struggles surrounding the right to free speech. I will now hand it over to the co-sponsor of our event, Amy Aronson, chair of Fordham University's Department of Communications and Media Studies. She will introduce the speakers, after which our moderator will frame and facilitate the presentations by the panelists and then lead the discussion and Q&A session that will follow. Depending on how we are doing with time and on how many questions we have, she will either call on folks to pose their questions themselves, in which case you will be promoted as a panelist, or she will instead relay your questions to the panelists herself. Just in case, I would encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can do that at any point. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. And with that, I leave you with Amy Aronson.
Thank you so much, Juan. I just want to say what a wonderful opportunity it's been working with you and how much I have enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to our collaborations going forward. And I just feel so honored to be part of organizing this event. The bios of our distinguished speakers are available on the invitation and available on the web. So I feel that they barely need any further introduction. So I will just say Susan Herman, Ellen Chesler, Laura Vapnik, Jeff Stone. Your work has been so formative for me and for so many, thousands of others. And I'm just thrilled to have the chance to hear from all of you together in one place. So I will now turn it over to Susan Herman to get things going.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thanks all of you for being here and for inviting me. The last time that I did a program for the Village Preservation, Amy and I were doing a program that was about the Greenwich Village origins of the ACLU in 2020, which was the 100th anniversary of the ACLU's founding. And since I was the president of the ACLU at the time, I spent a lot of time in the lead up to that centennial thinking about all the movements that had led to the coalescing of all the issues that the ACLU was dealing with and the free speech ideas. And what was amazing to me too was how so many of the founders of the ACLU were involved in multiple issues in multiple areas. And it was like the same cast of characters kept appearing with different hats, as the pacifists, the socialists, the reproductive freedom people, suffragists. And nobody better exemplifies that. I'm going to share my screen now and show you, including starting with Crystal Eastman. Now, if you haven't read Amy Aronson's great biography of Crystal Eastman, it's quite wonderful. My only complaint about it was that if you'd written it just a year sooner, Amy, you would have saved me a lot of work. So Crystal she was a suffragist, she was a socialist, she was an internationalist, but it was in her role as a pacifist that she ended up having the idea that created the ACLU. She had been the head of the American Union Against Militarism, which was very active in trying to fight American preparedness before World War I, just as trying to fight the militarization and the expectation that the United States was going to end up in the war. So this is a parade that took place in the village, which is very typical of the incredibly creativity of these social movements. They introduced a giant paper mache dinosaur called Jingo, who ended up going extinct because he didn't understand that belligerence was not really a good idea. So there were parades, there were all sorts of public education demonstrations, just tremendous use of free speech around their basic pacifism. The group was credited, among other things, with helping to avert a war between the United States and Mexico by having a people-to-people delegation. So they were really quite serious about pacifism and trying to fight the whole idea of the war. However, as 1917 rolled around, Crystal's brother Max, who was the publisher of The Masses, a radical magazine that was about radical politics, art, politics, very anti-war, published in the village, of course. This is one of the many wonderful covers that they came up with. And Max was, when the United States entered World War I in 1917, Congress passed a lot of unfortunate statutes about sedition and espionage, and Max ended up with several other people being prosecuted for trying to disseminate these anti-war ideas. He was not convicted, but what Crystal realized as the head of the American Union Against Militarism was that it had become really dangerous to advocate, to speak out against the war, to speak out against the draft, and to speak out against the American form of government. At the time, of course, the United States Supreme Court was not a place where you could argue that you had free speech rights to do such things. So what Crystal did was she decided on a pivot, and she recommended that the American Union Against Militarism start a National Civil Liberties Bureau, as she proposed calling it, to represent conscientious objectors in their free speech rights and just in their general right to object to the war. And Crystal's idea was to couch her anti-war activism into more general terms about civil liberties. So the ACLU, the National Civil Liberties Bureau, and then it was reconstituted as the ACLU in 1920. And the ACLU used a whole lot of free speech. They used demonstrations. They used a whole lot of educational materials, sending out pamphlets and all sorts of things to try to convince people that free speech rights were critical to democracy and that people should have the right to dissenting speech, even in time of war, even in other times. So this at the time was a pretty radical idea, and Roger Baldwin became the first executive director of the ACLU, and he was somebody who himself had been a conscientious objector and who was so sincere about his opposition to war that he refused to even do alternative service and ended up spending some time in prison. Another person very much involved with the early ACLU was Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was the ACLU's first counsel. And again, being purveyors of free speech as well as advocates of free speech, what Baldwin and Hayes really enjoyed doing was to have demonstrations in which they would read the text of the First Amendment and dare the local officials to arrest them for illegal assembly, because they just loved the irony that they would be arrested for exercising their free speech rights. So here's Arthur Garfield Hayes on top of a car. You can see him exercising his free speech rights and having what may well have been an illegal assembly. So again, I was really struck by the fact that you could have a walking tour about the things that the ACLU was doing in its early years. The offices were at 75th Avenue for quite a while, along with many other organizations. And so from 75th Avenue, the ACLU was involved in free speech battles and due process battles all over the country. So it was Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was really the mastermind behind the Scopes case. Clarence Darrow ended up being engaged by the ACLU to actually go and represent Mr. Scopes, the high school teacher who was told that he was committing a crime in Tennessee by teaching the theories of Charles Darwin instead of the Bible's idea of creation. So that was a national idea, free speech idea that was kind of the germs were all in the village. It was taking place in the village. The defense of Sacco and Vanzetti was also very much centered in the village. There were rallies for Sacco and Vanzetti and Webster Hall, another place where you could just go physically and look at the origins of free speech. Not to mention, Cooper Union, and there are all sorts of spots in the village and surrounding areas where you could really just map the battle for free speech. So where I want to conclude my introductory remarks is that free speech grew in the ACLU and in other places, to the point where the ACLU now lists 14 different areas of civil rights and civil liberties that are the ACLU's mission. But virtually everything began with free speech. We trace the origins of our reproductive freedom work back to our defense of Margaret Sanger way early on, which Ellen knows all about this, where Margaret Sanger was the idea of advertising Planned Parenthood was considered tantamount to promoting obscenity. And so the ACLU got involved with just her right to try to engage in those ideas and publish pamphlets, etc. We trace our LGBT work back to the defense of Lillian Hellman's play, The Children's Hour, which has a theme of lesbianism, which was literally banned in Boston. So all of these battles, all of these civil liberties, which the ACLU has seen as all kind of intersectional and interrelated, all coalesce around free speech. And so that's where I just wanted to sort of set the stage for the big picture of all the different kinds of issues, civil liberties issues, which have their roots in free speech and which would not really be possible to talk about without free speech, both the publications, the actual speech, and the freedom of assembly. So from there, we're going to go to Ellen Chesler, who will be our next speaker. Ellen?
Thank you so much, Susan. And actually, the relationship between Margaret Sanger and Roger Baldwin goes back even a little further to 1916, when she was touring to talk about birth control in those early days. He was then a social worker in St. Louis. Her speech was shut down, and he decided to devote himself to civil liberties. So a nice little story, but that gets a little ahead of my presentation. Let's just start with a little bit background on who was Margaret Sanger, because some of our viewers may not know the story. Born Margaret Louisa Higgins in 1879, she was the middle child of a large and poor Irish Catholic family in Corning, New York, where she learned to dream at an early age from a magnetic father who made a living carving cemetery monuments, but squandered away his talents and his humane social vision on a bit too much talk and a lot too much drink. From an overburdened but resourceful mother, however, she was lucky to absorb her powerful motivation to improve her own lot and the lot of women, along with essential habits of discipline that made it possible for her to do so, to build a global social movement. It's not too much to say, I think, that Margaret Sanger warred between rebellion and comportment for her entire life. She grew first, however, into a follower of labor organizers, freethinkers, and bohemians, many of whom gathered in Greenwich Village in those halcyon days at the start of the 20th century, when it was kind of easy to believe in the potential of individual and social renewal, in the inevitability of human progress. Before World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the rest of the 20th century, which needs no elaboration, created far more sober realities. Married while she was a nursing student to William Sanger, an architect and painter of Jewish background, she joined a vibrant community of such legendary activists as Big Bill Haywood, Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the Eastons mentioned already, and certainly we're going to hear more about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. The attractive young couple was especially popular in this crowd. They organized pickets, strikes, and pageants from their dining room table in an apartment actually not in the village, but uptown in Washington Heights. They sent their children, however, to a village school named for the Spanish revolutionary Francisco Ferrer. Organizers of that school would later be implicated, by the way, in a failed plot to blow up the Rockefeller Mansion in New York, a plot the Sangers had nothing to do with, I should add. But no gods, no masters, the rallying cry of the IWW became Margaret's personal and political manifesto. And her association with radicalism certainly made her an easier target when she then brazenly challenged obscenity laws that governed contraception. A few more biographical highlights from this period in her life. During this time, her husband quit or perhaps lost his position in architecture, which was notoriously anti-Semitic at the time, and began to paint, forcing Margaret to help support their young family by working as a visiting nurse in the immigrant communities of New York's Lower East Side. Following the death of a patient from then all too common illegal abortion, she vowed to abandon palliative work and instead overturn obscenity laws that prevented legal access to safe, reliable contraception. As a result of largely private arrangements, withdrawal was a major practice, and a healthy underground mail order trade in condoms, douches, and various contraptions sold under the subterfuge of feminine hygiene. Birth rates in America had begun to decline, but particularly immigrant women had a hard time navigating this trade and understanding. And of course, doctors wouldn't touch contraception so long as it was illegal. Both contraception and sexuality in general remain clandestine and delicate subjects, legally banned in print and practice, named for the Victorian, under statutes named for the Victorian era conservative and anti-vice reformer enforcer. By inventing the term birth control, which she did in a village apartment, or at least that's the story she tells with some of her companions, Sanger brought the practice and by implication women's entitlement, not only to contraception, but also to sexual parity in marriage and to sexual pleasure. And she helped lift legal constraints, but also most importantly, the religious strap that had long encased reproduction. She later secured the endorsement of contraception by physicians and social scientists, many of them women, but many of them men. And that was really important in the 1930s and 40s. From this singular accomplishment, however, which allowed secular scientific people to intervene in what had long been the province of the church, she's long been considered heretical, and a continuing controversy has ensued. I mean, I would argue that what happened in the Supreme Court is all about, theocracy reasserting itself in America. Sanger's fundamental heresy was in claiming every woman's right to experience her sexuality freely and bear only the number of children she desires. Famously, she wrote in a book in 1920, "No woman can call herself free unless she owns and controls her own body," a quote that certainly resonates again today. Let's remember that it was about more than just contraception, however. Following the first generation of educated women who had foregone marriage in order to pursue fulfillment outside the home, she offered birth control as a necessary condition to the resolution of a broader range of personal and professional satisfactions for women. The hardest challenge in introducing her to modern audiences, since we take these ideas for granted, is to explain how absolutely destabilizing they appeared in her own time. Let's remember that women at this time were still largely denied identities or rights of their own, independent of their relationships with men, including the right to vote. Their very existence as citizens along a whole range of pursuits, economic, social, and political, were covered legally by men. This body of laws was really not challenged until Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the ACLU in the 1970s did so. Famously in 1912, the Supreme Court refused to hear a case of battery against a woman, arguing that it was not its province to interfere in the home. But back for a few moments to Sanger. In 1914, her marriage falling apart under the pressure of the free love ethos of the village, Bohemia, Margaret published a paper called The Woman Rebel, which was immediately confiscated and shut down by Anthony Comstock. Facing an almost certain jail sentence, she fled the country under an alias to Europe, made the acquaintance of prominent Fabian and socialist progressive thinkers like Havelock Ellis, the sexologist and architect of social medicine in Britain, and H.G. Wells, perhaps then the most prominent writer in the Western world. Charges against Sanger were actually dropped when she returned to New York almost a year later, her husband having served a short jail sentence in the interim for distributing Family Limitation, a pamphlet she left behind that gave women explicit instructions contraceptive options. There were also some tragic deaths that the court came to consider. The Sanger's 4-year-old daughter died from pneumonia shortly after her mother returned to New York, having been away the better part of a year. But most importantly, perhaps not for Sanger, but for the cause, was that Anthony Comstock died. And with birth control so much in the news, and Sanger having become not only a national but an international celebrity, I think the powers that be just decided to drop the charges against her. She changed from being a free speech advocate then to being someone who decided that contraception really was mainly medical, and she had to not only talk about it, but actually provide it. Quite deliberately, to challenge the law, she opened a clinic in Brooklyn in 1916 to actually distribute a primitive form of the diaphragm or pessary to immigrant women. She served in jail for 30 days, again, becoming a huge international celebrity. But on appeal to the appellate courts in New York, she was given a medical exception to the New York State Comstock statute that licensed doctors to prescribe contraception for reasons of health. Through this constraint, she built a network of independent local women's health centers that eventually came together under the banner of Planned Parenthood. And during the next 20 years, she also lobbied, as was mentioned, for the repeal of federal obscenity statutes that prevented the legal transport of contraception by physicians across state lines, and won in federal court in 1936, so that all states but Connecticut and Massachusetts, which remained under the thumb of the Catholic Church, did allow for Planned Parenthood clinics and doctors to prescribe contraception. These contraceptive laws, however, some of them in some states still remain on the book, and we're getting ahead of the story here, but becoming very important in the whole set of legal challenges now to the transport by mail of medication abortion. But we can talk about that later, perhaps in the Q&A. Briefly, I have about 5 minutes or 7 minutes left. Sanger always remained a wildly polarizing figure, which clarifies the logic of her decision after World War I to jettison birth control and adopt the more socially resonant language of family planning. This move, I've argued for over 30 years, was particularly inventive, but in no way cynical, especially when the Great Depression brought attention to collective needs and the New Deal created a blueprint for bold public endeavors. Some have charged that Sanger defined family planning as a right of the privileged, but a duty or obligation of the poor. To the contrary, I would argue she showed considerable foresight in lobbying to legalize contraception and include universal family planning, voluntary family planning programs, among public investments in Social Security. Had the New Deal incorporated basic public health and access to contraception in those days, as most European countries did, protracted conflicts over welfare and healthcare policy in the United States might well have been avoided. Having long enjoyed the friendship and support of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Sanger also had ample reason to believe that New Dealers would fully legalize and endorse contraception as her first necessary step to a long-term goal of transferring responsibility and accountability for clinics to the public health sector. What she failed to anticipate was the force of opposition that family planning continued to generate from a coalition of religious conservatives, including urban Catholics and rural fundamentalist Protestants, who held Roosevelt Democrats captive, much as today's evangelicals have captured the GOP. The US government would not overcome cultural and religious objections to family planning through its domestic anti-poverty and international development programs until the late 60s, after the Supreme Court protected contraceptive use under the privacy doctrine created in Griswold, which again is at risk. This time, of course, Planned Parenthood clinics became major government contractors since there were few alternative primary healthcare centers serving the poor in that era. Today, nearly one in three of American women fund for contraception through government programs many of them still run by Planned Parenthood. A number that has risen under the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate, which obligates both public and also private health insurance, which for a long time was not obligated to pay for contraception. We can talk about what this all means later again. Very briefly, Sanger's eagerness to mainstream her movement after World War I also displaying her engagement with eugenics, and then widely popular movement that addressed the manner in which human intelligence and opportunity is determined by biological as well as environmental factors. Hard it is to believe eugenics at this time was considered more respectable than birth control and embraced a spectrum of ideological viewpoints from right to left. Like many well-intentioned reformers of this era, Sanger took away from Charles Darwin the essentially optimistic lesson that humanity's evolution within the animal kingdom makes us all capable of improvement if only we apply the right tools. University presidents, physicians, scientists, public officials embraced eugenics, in part, not in any way understanding it to be about social or racial or economic hierarchies, but quite to the contrary, the promise that merit or ability would replace fate or birthright or social status as the standard for mobility in a truly democratic society. Neo-Malthusians on the left also saw birth control as a way for workers to gain more control over the balance of supply and demand for labor and the distribution of natural resources in a fast growing and competitive world. This was a kind of a prominent argument to classic Marxism, where the men would say, we need armies for proletariat and women should have all the babies they want. Eugenics, of course, also has a damning and today unfathomable legacy, including a series of state laws upheld in 1927 by an 8-to-1 progressive majority of the US Supreme Court, including Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis. Holmes wrote the decision. Their landmark decision in Buffalo authorized the compulsory sterilization of a poor young white woman with an illegitimate child on grounds of feeble-mindedness that were never clearly established. This decision, incidentally, was not opposed and looked upon, I think, favorably by W.E. Du Bois of the NAACP and Roger Baldwin of the ACLU, both of whom Sanger continued to count among her supporters and colleagues. For Sanger, eugenics was meant to begin with the voluntary use of birth control, which many still opposed, on the grounds that the middle class should be encouraged to have more babies. She never formally allied with eugenicists because she wanted everybody to have fewer children. She disdained what she called a cradle competition of class, race, or ethnicity. She opposed publicly immigration restrictions and framed poverty as a matter of differential access to resources like birth control, not as the immutable consequence of low inheritability or character. As a nurse, she also understood the adverse impacts of poor nutrition, drugs, and alcohol on fetal development and supported government maternal and infant health care. She argued for broad social safety nets and proudly marshaled clinical data to demonstrate that most women, even among the poorest and least educated populations, eagerly embraced and used birth control successfully. At the same time, she did engage in many instances in shrill rhetoric about the growing burden of large families of low intelligence and defective heredity, language with no intended racial or ethnic content, but language hard to fathom today. She always argued that women were better off with fewer children, but unfortunate language about creating a race of thoroughbreds and other such phrases have in recent years been lifted out of context and sullied her reputation. Sanger quite clearly failed in endorsing eugenics for the mentally defective, to consider fundamental human rights questions raised by these practices. The challenge, as her biographer, has been to reconcile many apparent contradictions in her beliefs. She actually held unusually advanced views on race relations for her day, and on many occasions condemned discrimination and encouraged reconciliation between Black and white. Though most birth control facilities conformed to the segregation mores of the day, she actually opened an integrated clinic in Harlem in the early 1930s and later facilitated birth control and maternal health programs for rural Black women in the South, when local white public health officials there denied them access to any New Deal funded services. Sanger worked on this last project not only with the help of Du Bois and Adam Clayton Powell Sr., but also with behind the scenes support of Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, a founder of the National Council for Negro Women and then a Roosevelt administration official. Their progressive views on race were well known, if controversial, but their support for birth control was silenced by Franklin's political handlers, at least until he was safely ensconced in the White House for a third term, when the government rushed to provide condoms to World War II soldiers in 1942, but never, I should add, provided anything for women, either civilian or military. America's intensely complicated politics of race and gender has long ensnarled Sanger and all others who have sought to discipline reproduction. As many scholars of the subject in recent years have observed, much of the controversy proceeds from this plain fact that reproduction is by its very nature experienced individually and socially at the same time, raising all kinds of civil rights issues and human rights issues. In claiming women's fundamental right to control their own bodies, Sanger usually remained mindful of the dense fabric of cultural, political, and economic relationships in which these rights are exercised. In most instances, the policies she advocated observed the necessary obligation of social policy to respect individual rights, but by endorsing eugenics, or at least one aspect of it, she failed to get the balance quite right. I would argue this is nothing, should not poison her reputation or discredit her noble cause. Others obviously take a different view. Let me end with just part of a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who may have put it best in 1966 when he accepted Planned Parenthood's prestigious Margaret Sanger Award and spoke eloquently of the kinship between the civil rights and family planning movements. There is a striking kinship between our movement and Margaret Sanger's early efforts. He said, she, like we, saw the horrifying conditions of ghetto life. Like we, she knew that all of society is poisoned by cancerous slums. Like she was a direct actionist, a nonviolent resistor. She launched a movement which is obeying a higher law to preserve human life under humane conditions. Margaret Sanger had to commit what was then a crime in order to enrich humanity. And today we honor her courage and her vision, for without them, there would have been no beginning. Dare I say that maybe by reminding people of that quote, we'll next see King canceled. Why don't I end there on a more optimistic note, and we can go on to our next very esteemed speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for some fascinating and very rich history. There will be a lot for us to talk about later. And anyone who has a question or a thought inspired by what Ellen was saying is welcome to put a question in the Q&A, which we'll get to when we have our general discussion. But I told the other panelists that I would give them a kind of a first chance to engage. So Lara or Jeff, is there anything in particular that you would like to engage with Ellen on, a question or a particular comment for now?
Margaret Sanger was opposed strongly to abortion in those early years. What do you think about that?
Well, let's start by saying that abortion today is different in every possible way from what Margaret Sanger opposed, except, by the way, talk about it. Margaret Sanger was opposed to what in those days, because you didn't know you were pregnant often, and I mean, there was no test that you could take until the late 1930s, actually, to determine pregnancy. So you really had to wait almost to quickening, but often much later in the reproductive cycle, so that abortion was in a much more complicated procedure, both medically and morally. In addition, she was a kind of, I think, pretty savvy political strategist, and she understood that if people could legalize birth control, that would, you know, abortion was an argument against legalizing birth control, and she thought she would take things one step at a time. I did discover, I mean, I wrote my book 30 years ago, and it's a long and complicated book, but happily still in print in a new edition. And I found a great deal in the archives to show that, especially during the Depression, when women were desperate not to have children that they couldn't afford. She provided many, many women with safe legal abortions through her 17th Street clinic. We can talk more about that later again as well.
Okay, I think maybe we may want to go into that more later, but just keeping an eye on the clock. Lara, why don't we move to your presentation now?
Sounds great. That sounds
away.
great. Yeah, that sounds great. And I guess just to quickly comment on Sanger, I think it's such an interesting presentation. And I think part of the question, with birth control is sort of who's in control of it? Is it the state or is it individuals? And the problem with the state being in control of it, of course, is an issue with the eugenics movement. So I think in a way that ties into what I'm going to talk about with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Okay, just getting let's see. Getting my slideshow up and running. Yes, so thank you so much to my fellow panelists, and also thanks so much to Amy for inviting me to present. I'm going to focus on Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and she spent her life fighting for gender and class equality and for the right to free speech. Flynn lived from 1890 to 1964, and she divided her life into two parts. The first part with the industrial workers of the world from 1907 to 1916, and the second part with the Communist Party from 1937 to 1964. So I am going to focus more on her first life because that seems more connected to what we're talking about this evening. But throughout her life, she was very connected to battles for free speech, in part because she was so far to the left that she was pretty much always advocating for dissenting ideas. And as we've discussed, in the early 20th century, Greenwich Village was really a hotbed for dissenting ideas and radical social movements, including feminism, labor, peace, and birth control. Flynn grew up in the Bronx, but she spent quite a bit of time in the village, attending meetings, giving talks, visiting friends, and frequenting some of her favorite Italian restaurants. And one of the things that I think is so cool about the Greenwich Village Preservation Society is sort of thinking about the village as, sort of like this social context and this place where people of different classes and kind of political persuasions, came together. So Flynn grew up in an Irish American family. They converted, as she said, to socialism when she was a child, and she began her career as a public speaker at the age of 15, holding forth from a soapbox. By 1906, newspapers called her an East Side Joan of Arc. And as a budding public speaker, Flynn greatly admired Emma Goldman, the Jewish anarchist from Russia, whose picture, of course, was on our event page. Flynn described hearing Goldman speak around 1905, noting the force, eloquence, and fire that poured from this mild-mannered, motherly sort of woman whose views on birth control, marriage, and love seemed dangerously radical at the time. Goldman rejected marriage as no better than legalized prostitution, and she advocated for birth control, arguing that women could not be free unless they had control over their own bodies. Goldman's speeches and writings helped Flynn to think critically about these issues. In a speech called Men and Women, Flynn described socialism as producing a free woman socially and sexually, a woman who thinks as she pleases, does as she pleases, works as she pleases, speaks as she pleases, and belongs to herself alone. Or, as Goldman explained, women's development, her freedom, her independence must come from and through herself. First, by asserting herself as a personality and not as a sex commodity. Second, by refusing the right to anyone over her body, by refusing to bear children unless she wants them, by refusing to be a servant to God, the state, society, the husband, the family, etc., by freeing herself from the fear of public opinion and public condemnation. Only that, and not the ballot, will set her free. And Flynn and Goldman both considered the battle for women's suffrage to be a waste of time. As I said, she was, very radical. Both women saw the state as a tool of capitalist domination, and they argued that the vote had not done much for working men, so they did not really think women should waste their time with it. In 1907, Flynn became an agitator for the industrial workers of the world. And the industrial workers of the world were a radical labor union that sought to organize all workers into one big union. As they declared in their preamble, the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things in life. The IWW, or the Wobblies as they were known, sought to organize workers all together, and they were hoping that one big union would be the basis for a new society. They focused on workers who were ignored by the mainstream labor movement, and they sought to organize across divisions of skill, as well as ethnicity and race and gender. The Wobblies used free speech battles as organizing techniques, and from 1909 to 1910, Flynn led two of the first free speech battles in Missoula, Montana, and Spokane, Washington. The Wobblies needed to be able to speak freely on city streets in order to pursue their strategy of direct action. And here I think there's some interesting connections between Susan's presentation and also what Ellen's presentation as well. And this was an organizing technique that the Wobblies really developed. It was built around public protest. They often would roll into town and start criticizing local labor contractors. They courted mass arrest as a form of civil disobedience. Vigilantes and the police had little patience for the Wobblies, and Flynn herself was arrested at least a dozen times, including in Spokane when she was 6 months pregnant. Flynn returned home to New York in April of 1910, just in time to give birth to her son, Fred. And Flynn advocated free love in her speeches, but in fact, when she became pregnant, she felt compelled to marry the baby's father, in part because she needed to maintain her respectability in order to be able to operate as a woman within a still male-dominated labor movement, certainly even within the IWW, and also because her family, although they were quite radical politically, were somewhat conservative when it came to issues like unwed motherhood. Back on the East Coast, Flynn led two landmark strikes for the IWW, the first in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, and the second in Paterson, New Jersey in 1913. In both labor conflicts, Flynn made a special outreach to women, and in doing so, she discovered how burdened many of them were by large families. This increased and affirmed her advocacy for birth control. She argued that it was absolutely necessary for working women to be able to limit the size of their families. And in 1912, in the Lawrence, Massachusetts strike, in which about 23,000 workers in the wool industry walked off their job, she worked closely with Margaret Sanger, of course, who Ellen was just talking about, to evacuate the children of Lawrence to sympathetic families in New York City. And images like this of the strikers' children parading through the streets built public support for the strike, and it allowed the women who were left in Lawrence to participate more fully. At this point, there were really different strategies to untangling the problems of women's economic exploitation. Probably the more well-known one would be the Women's Trade Union League, who supported the famous uprising of the 20,000 from 1909 to 1910, and identified cross-class organizing by women as central to bringing women into trade unions. But Flynn, again, really had no interest in the Women's Trade Union League. She did not believe in cross-class alliances, famously pronouncing the sisterhood of woman, like the brotherhood of man, to be a hollow sham. So this statement really fit within the IWW strategy of heightening class conflict in order to bring about revolution. However, as I explain in my book, it also obscured the cross-class friendships that Flynn developed in the village in the 1910s, including with people like Mary Heaton Vorse, who was a journalist that Flynn met in Lawrence. And those friendships became very important in 1913 when the IWW stepped in to lead the silk workers' strike in Paterson, New Jersey. The police in Lawrence had responded with a lot of violence, and in Paterson, it was more, there was certainly violence, but also a strategy of mass arrests. And so that was sort of how the local authorities, part of the way that they were dealing with the strike, mass arrests and trials of strike leaders. The journalist Jack Reed staged a pageant at Madison Square Garden in June of 1913 to support the striking workers. And I think this is a great example of the village as a place of just, I guess, synergy, we would say, you know, amongst different types of people. Flynn participated in the pageant and thought it was a great artistic success, but ultimately felt that it was a distraction from the strike itself, which the IWW lost a few months later. But when Flynn was arrested for speaking in Paterson, after she had been barred by the city, she found the villagers' support for her right to free speech to be really invaluable. Although Flynn had discounted publicly the value of cross-class alliances, an all-female committee raised money to pay her legal costs and provided an attorney to defend her. And when some of these same women invited Flynn to join Heterodoxy, the club where the term feminism was coined, she accepted their invitation. After years of working with men, Flynn found discussions at Heterodoxy to be a broadening experience, and these conversations confirmed her belief that women were entitled to an individual identity as well as control over their own bodies. However, as I've suggested, I think Flynn's vision of women's freedom differed somewhat from many of her feminist contemporaries, people like Crystal Eastman, who were very involved in the suffrage movement. Flynn insisted on the primacy of social class, and she saw capitalism as the central force in women's oppression. Only the end of wage slavery and the establishment of socialism would create the potential for women, like men, to become free and independent, Flynn believed. These utopian ideals that had so many different strands, I think, in the early 20th century in the village would really be severely tested by World War I, which destroyed the IWW more or less, and led to the imprisonment of thousands of people opposed to the war and the deportation of hundreds, including, of course, Emma Goldman. managing to escape a long prison sentence herself after she, along with the other, I think it was 168 leaders of the IWW, were charged with sedition. Flynn became a founder of the Workers' Defense Union, whose offices were actually off of Union Square, and also was very much aligned with the early American Civil Liberties Union. She was in close contact with Roger Baldwin and was also involved in publicizing the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. She considered herself to be a founding member of the ACLU, although in 1940, she would be expelled due to her membership in the Communist Party. So in closing, and this is just, sorry, I forgot about this slide, just sort of suggesting the scope of the repression during World War I, which is very difficult to, capture in a slide, but this is sort of at the point where Ellis Island had gone from being a place that accepted and processed immigrants to actually really a prison where they were gathered before being deported. So in closing, Flynn's fights for free speech in the early 20th century show, I think, the importance of organizing to achieve social change, the necessity sometimes of championing ideas that might be unpopular, the need to find new and creative modes of political engagement. And I think in the context of Greenwich Village and the project of preserving it, the need to remember sites of radical action as well as political repression. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lara, for that great history. So same comment as before. If you have any questions for Lara, please write them in the Q&A, but I'll give Ellen and then Jeff a chance to engage, particularly if you'd like to at this point. Ellen, anything for now? Okay, and Jeff, anything for now, or do you want to just launch into what you were going to say?
Yeah, I'm happy to pass now and as you said, launch into what I was going to say.
Okay, so launch away.
I'm going to speak in particular about the context in which the Lower East Side of New York had an important impact on free speech in the United States. It's important to note that until World War I, the Supreme Court of the United States had never decided a case interpreting the First Amendment, which among other things provides that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In the years leading up to World War I, the American people very much wanted not to get engaged in that war. Their view was that they didn't know what the hell people were fighting about, but it didn't seem to have anything to do with them or their interests, and they weren't prepared to die for something they did not understand. Woodrow Wilson, recognizing that, took exactly that position in order to get reelected in 1916 on the claim that he kept us out of war. Nonetheless, shortly after he was elected, Wilson changed his mind and sought a declaration of war against Germany in order to bring the United States into the conflict. Now, one question was, what was the reason for that? Most citizens who were opposed to the war or the draft believed that what changed Wilson's mind was that American capitalists had been making a lot of money by selling war materials to England and France during the earlier years of the war. But German submarines had begun to sink American ships in order to prevent them from bringing those types of materials to their enemies. The capitalists basically went to Wilson and said, "You've got to stop this. We have an opportunity to make lots of money here, so let's get into this war and enable us to essentially reestablish the financial benefits that we're getting from this." Wilson, to the surprise of many, then sought a declaration of war, which Congress approved, although not without serious debate. This led to enormous dissent across the nation, because most Americans, indeed, up until that point, had not understood that this conflict in Europe, which has cost millions and millions of lives, had anything to do with the interests of the United States. And the dissents were often virulent and enthusiastic and energetic, And Wilson was very upset with this because he understood full well that if you want to win a war, you've got to get the people to support it. Otherwise, they will not buy war bonds, they will refuse induction into the military, they will take all sorts of steps to interfere with the war effort. So he went to Congress in 1917 and sought the enactment of the Espionage Act of 1917, which after considerable deliberation, the Congress approved of. Among other things, the Espionage Act of 1917 made it a crime for any person to engage in any speech activity that criticized the war or the draft, and also authorized the Postmaster General to remove from the mails any pamphlet or magazine or newspaper that had positions that were contrary to the interests of the government. Now, the Masters magazine, and you saw a picture of that earlier, the Masters magazine was a revolutionary journal published on the Lower East Side of New York. It was filled with bold drawings, lively social satire, political criticism and cartoons, and intellectual commentary by such figures as Emma Goldman and Max Eastman, among many others. It was indeed an extreme left-wing, by our standards, publication. But in fact, even though many of its cartoons and many of the poems and articles were sharply critical of the war, none of them actually urged anyone to refuse induction or to affirmatively oppose the war. Nonetheless, in 1917, the Postmaster General of the United States issued an order excluding the masses from the mails on the claim that it violated the Espionage Act. The masses sued, claiming that this act violated the First Amendment. Now, at this time, lower courts who dealt with issues under the Espionage Act had, almost without exception, embraced an approach that said that the First Amendment is not violated if the government punishes an individual who engages in speech that has what was called a bad tendency. That is, it could lead others to engage in inappropriate or illegal or disruptive conduct, as long as the speaker had what was called constructive intent. That is, that the speaker should reasonably have known that his views could in fact lead to such consequences, even if that was not his actual intent to achieve. Applying that approach, some 2,000 Americans were prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms for violating the Espionage Act, for doing nothing more than criticizing the war or the draft. The Masses case came before federal judge Learned Hand. Hand was one of the great legal figures of the first part of the 20th century. And in a bold decision, Hand said that the government could prohibit such speech only if it expressly advocated unlawful conduct, which the masses did not. So Hand basically says the First Amendment has to be understood, and the Espionage Act has to be understood as protecting speech, critical of the government, critical of the war, as long as the speech did not expressly advocate violation of the law. And therefore, he concluded the masses had not engaged in that type of speech and ordered the Postmaster General to allow the masses to be in the mail. This decision was reversed almost immediately on appeal because it was so completely revolutionary and regarded as unpatriotic. And the masses was thereafter shut down and put out of business. Hand himself was expected at that point to be promoted to the Court of Appeals or ultimately to the Supreme Court because he was such a distinguished jurist. That passed. Finally, some 20 years later, he was appointed to the Court of Appeals, but never made it to the Supreme Court, all because of hostility to the opinion he wrote in Masses. Nonetheless, Masses' opinion, Hand's opinion in Masses, came over time to play a central role in America's understanding of the First Amendment and in contemporary First Amendment jurisprudence. Okay, the second case that I will mention was known as Abrams versus United States. Now, in 1919, the Supreme Court decided a series of cases under the Espionage Act, in which the question was whether opponents of the war could be criminally punished consistent with the First Amendment. An example of this was the Socialist Party's candidate for president in 1912 and 1916, who was prosecuted for giving a speech in which he lauded the courage of an individual who had refused induction into the military. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In each of these three cases, in the spring of 1919, the court, in unanimous decisions, upheld the convictions, applying the bad tendency and constructive intent tests, and therefore effectively writing the First Amendment in any meaningful way out of our Constitution. Now, let me go back a little bit in time to the next case, the Abrams case. In 1913, Molly Steimer, at the age of 15, arrived at Ellis Island with her parents as part of the flood of immigrants fleeing poverty and anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia. Steimer was a mere slip of a girl, only 4'9" tall and weighing less than 90 pounds. When her family arrived in New York, they moved to the Lower East Side, where Steimer worked in a grimy garment factory. She believed, however, in a new social order in which no group would govern another, and in which people would no longer divide themselves into warring factions. She was courageous, bold, and determined. With the outbreak of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Steimer threw herself into political action. And in the summer of 1918, she and several other young workers were furious that the United States had sent American troops into Vladivostok. They printed two leaflets, one in Yiddish, the other in English, asserting that there is, quote, only one enemy of the workers of the world, and that is capitalism. The leaflets called for a general strike to protest the government's action. Steimer and her colleagues were quickly arrested and prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917. Steimer and her colleagues were convicted, and Steimer was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The case came to the United States Supreme Court, known as Abrams versus United States, one of the co-defendants, and the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, upheld the convictions, relying upon the prior decisions from the preceding fall. For the first time, though, Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis dissented, asserting that the government cannot constitutionally punish someone for speech criticizing the government or government policy, even in wartime, unless the speech creates a clear and present danger of grave harm. This was a momentously important opinion on the part of Holmes and Brandeis, but it was a dissenting opinion in which the other 7 justices disagreed. Over the course of the next half century, gradually, in part under the leadership of the ACLU, individuals and courts began to embrace the Holmes-Brandeis approach. But even in 1950, for example, the Supreme Court did not apply that approach and upheld the convictions of all of the leaders of the Communist Party of the United States, even though they could not have been punished under the Holmes-Brandeis approach. It was not until the late 1960s when the Supreme Court finally, in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, embraced the approach that had been advocated by Molly Steimer and adopted by Holmes and Brandeis, and to this day fundamentally changed free speech in our nation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. So these are such rich histories, and what we're going to be turning to for the next part of the program is the general question of the insights these histories offer into the current political moment. But before we get to those broader questions, Ellen and Lara, is there anything that you would like to pick up from what Jeff was saying and comment on before we go to that more general topic or leading there?
I just want to say I'm always happy to hear about Molly Steimer. She was sort of somebody that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn did a lot of, work with the Workers' Defense Union to try to publicize her case. And I think, it also just, Molly Steimer was a supporter of her family, like so many workers that were rounded up and arrested or deported. And all of these people were deported. And in many cases, their families were left in the United States without even a breadwinner or any kind of support. So one thing that, Flynn did was actually with the Workers' Defense Union was to try to find ways sometimes to get the families to Russia rather than leaving them behind in the United States in total poverty. So yeah, the whole thing was, it was a mess, but the legal side of it actually sounds very organized compared to the way that it was experienced on the ground.
If I can add one other point about Molly Steimer, who really is one of my heroes. She was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but after the war ended, she, like many of the other people convicted during the war, were released. But because she was not an American citizen, she was deported back to Russia. And she was not unhappy about that, because after the communist revolution, this was the country she wanted. When she got there, however, she was very quickly disillusioned and infuriated by what the government was actually doing there. And she began criticizing the Russian government, the Soviet government, and was expelled from the Soviet Union and deported to Mexico, where she wound up spending the rest of her life. But she's really one of my heroes of the First Amendment. No one else had ever been deported from the United States to Russia and then out of Russia.
I just wanted to say that interestingly, Learned Hand was the judge on the US v1 package decision that essentially overturned the federal Comstock law in 1936. So not only did he have free speech, but also birth control on his resume, which probably prevented him from getting an appointment to the Supreme Court. I also just wanted to comment on, the difference. Flynn and Sanger remained close friends actually as older women into their old age, despite the tremendously divergent political paths they took. Sanger tried to mainstream her movement, as I said, became a Roosevelt Democrat, essentially, although she swore that, particularly after Franklin didn't make birth control part of the public health process and didn't help, move toward legalization, that she voted for Norman Thomas till her death as a socialist. But she became a much more conservative person, and in part under the tutelage of her European colleagues, particularly H.G. Wells, who also left socialism and kind of began to shape her belief in more of a managed capitalism, I guess. Particularly, they were big supporters of Roosevelt in that respect. And finally, that they actually too went to Russia in the 1930s. The two of them together, they were, just because it's fun to talk about this in the context of the free love bohemia of Greenwich Village, they were longtime lovers as well as colleagues, and occasional lovers. Each had partners of their own. She married a second time. Being her biographer, particularly since the book grew out of a dissertation which was about the institutional history, that I found these letters in the Smith College Library that were so extraordinary. But they also too went to Russia, like Molly, and were hugely disillusioned in the Stalinist era.
So we have a question in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see it, Jeff, but I think this is for you. And it's a particular question about what caused Holmes to reverse course in his decisions. That Jeff's work and Schenck were all decided in 1919, resulted in the Supreme Court affirming convictions under the Espionage Act. But then Holmes writes the majority opinion, and then in Abrams, he dissents. So before we get more general, do you want to comment on Holmes's reversal?
Sure. So Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinions in the cases that were decided in the spring of 1919, upholding the convictions of those individuals who had been prosecuted under the Espionage Act, unanimous decisions. And then the following fall, when he heard the Abrams case, he wrote this very powerful and insightful dissent, which recognized a whole new understanding of the meaning of freedom of speech. And it was an eloquent opinion. So one of the great questions is what changed his mind? So one thing that happened was he wound up on a train with Learned Hand. And Learned Hand had a conversation with him about free speech. And Hand was very deferential because he was younger than Holmes and he was not as famous as Holmes. But he made a pretty strong argument about how important free speech is and needs to be taken seriously. And then Holmes was intrigued by this. And having gone back to Massachusetts for the summer, he had a number of conversations with leading constitutional scholars from around the country who basically persuaded him that his decisions to follow the preceding spring were wrong and that the First Amendment needed to be far more protected in order to have a meaningful democracy. And Holmes came back, and basically the nice thing about this, it illustrates the power and the importance of free speech. If those individuals had not criticized Holmes, and if he had not been willing to listen to their criticism, free speech in the United States today would be very different than it is. But Holmes learned from those discussions and took them seriously and changed his mind and led to a set of principles that now are the center of the United States free speech policy.
Thank you. Okay, so starting to look at this general question of what insights can we gain from the histories you've been telling that would be relevant to us today. One thing that I'm hearing all of you saying, which I think is a very positive message, is you've all been talking about people who had strong visions, dissenters who were willing to get out there and use free speech to try to effect social change that they thought was desirable. You know, Molly Steiner, Margaret Sanger, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Crystal Eastman, all women so far, Oliver Wendell Holmes and Learned Hand we could include. So we have a number of very positive role models about how you can use free speech to effect social change and how dissent is of tremendous value. But on the other hand, we also have a quite discouraging story, which I will quote Roger Baldwin, who used to say, "No civil liberties battle ever remains won." So the 20th century is a history of growing free speech in the courts, growing reproductive freedom, growing the toleration of, encouragement of labor unions and demonstrations, etc. And now we are in a point of backlash. So what would you like to comment in terms of no civil liberties battle remains won on the reproductive freedom front, on the labor front, on the free speech front?
I think it's important to understand that over the last half century, conservatives and religious individuals and groups in the United States have effectively engaged in exactly that sort of behavior and have changed American opinion from being basically very positive towards Roe to many of them being furious about Roe and to electing somebody like Donald Trump. And they have fundamentally used the very principles of free speech to achieve a set of goals that are completely antithetical to the people we're talking about in this history. And I think the lesson from it is people on our side need to wake up and to understand that this is how you save a democracy, and we cannot be passive about it. And so far, I don't think that's happening.
I would really say the same thing for labor rights. You know, a lot of labor rights were won in the 1930s, and, you know, with the victory of those labor rights, like the right to organize, you know, just basic things like that, there was a real mobilization on the other side that undercut a lot of those rights. And that was something, I mean, Flynn had a very long career, and that was something that she would emphasize, as she would say, you know, workers didn't just get their rights handed to them on a silver platter, they had to fight for them. And, you know, once they were won, it's not like they were won permanently. And so I think we can see over the course of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, sort of the expansion and contraction of labor rights, rights to free speech, and also rights to reproductive freedom.
I To qualify what Jeff said with respect to Roe, just a little bit. I think actually that most polls show that 80% of Americans still support legal abortion, many under the influence of the campaign that I've written about in many places that I don't think people understand the dimension of it, that began in 1992 when Bill Clinton was elected as the first pro-choice president, and when the court did not overturn Roe, but in fact passed Casey, which put many, many restrictions on Roe and kind of gave, in one of those sort of unintended consequences, an opportunity for state legislators to make their reputations off restricting abortion rights, but not completely changing them. But it became a vehicle for political conversation on the right. But still, even though some would support restrictions, whether waiting periods or parental consent or whatever, 80% still want legal abortion. So that the real issue in the United States is the structural issues in our government that really work against democracy. I mean, I don't know how to say it better than to say that we need to do something about the United States Senate being vastly unrepresentative of the will of the people, about the fact that even in the House, which is supposedly a more democratic institution, you have so much gerrymandering, but not only gerrymandering, you have so much consolidation of urban voters in certain districts and rural voters and others that, 7 or 8 or 9 million more Democrats will vote for, 7 or 8 or 9 million voters will vote Democratic, but the Republicans will still control the House. And I can't say much more than to say that we have to address those problems. If, I think we were to pass judgment on a new democracy today that had a structure the way that we do, we call it a banana republic. It's just a terrible problem that we've never been able to address adequately. And, Donald Trump was the perfect storm. And I think the structural problems in our government that I just outlined are exacerbated now by the internet's ability to create an echo chamber for big lies. Margaret Sanger is a classic example of somebody who's become the collateral victim of the abortion wars. Anybody who thought that history, could be captured or hijacked, didn't, have even enough imagination to envision what he's been able to do in terms of promoting big lies. I don't know where we're going exactly. I mean, people with bigger minds than mine will have to, begin to address that question. But I don't think it's a failure of the left. I feel that it's, if anything, our failure to have sort of predicted the way in which conservatives would use both abortion and race. I mean, gender and race. It's not just abortion. I mean, it's really a lot of question of parity for women. But, gender troubles and race troubles is the vehicle they clearly and consciously used to try to undo the Democratic New Deal majority. And maybe we didn't really understand how successful they'd be.
So I want to agree with Ellen that we do have a structural problem in our democracy, because what we have in the Dobbs case that just overruled Roe v. Wade is not only a triumph of activism, which I agree, Jeff, this is, you could just as a triumph of activism from the opposite point of view. But what the activists really managed to do was to take over the Supreme Court by having a president elected by a minority of people, appoint Supreme Court justices with the confirmation of the Senate representing a minority of people. And now that minority of people has a kind of a stranglehold over the law in the country through the Supreme Court. So what I've been thinking in terms of lessons that we can take from the early days, the 1920s and so forth, was the fact that at the time the ACLU was founded and started the campaign in the courts, nobody expected the courts to be upholding rights. And what they were doing was all this, the speaking, the organizing, the assembly, they were just trying to change minds. And they did not expect that the courts were going to back them. So I think we have to get back to the reliance on the speech itself and political movements as opposed to relying on the courts. I think that the left did become somewhat complacent because of Roe v. Wade. And I think some of that was that we were all trained in the Warren Court era to trust the courts. It's like the whole Holmes thing. Holmes came around, and the development all seems to be the arc of justice is moving toward the Supreme Court recognizing rights. And now that that's reversed itself, it's very troubling. So one figure I've been thinking about a lot is Felix Frankfurter, who counted himself as one of the founders of the ACLU. He wrote the book on Sacco and Vanzetti. You're raising everybody's attention, you're getting everyone's attention there. But when he got on the Supreme Court, he did not vote in favor of civil liberties. He voted in favor of requiring tax salutes in the Go-Bidas case. And what he thought was that the courts should not be having too big a footprint here. And there was just a biography of Frankfurter that came out where people were saying, hey, maybe he was right. So, I think part of the problem here is the Supreme Court. So we have another question in the chat too, but another couple. But so what do you think, Jeff? And is part of this the whole question of the role of the court here and judicial review?
A couple of comments. First, there's no way realistically to change the makeup of the Senate or the Electoral College. That was the result of a compromise that states made at the time the Constitution was adopted to enable them to get the smaller states to agree to enter the Union. Because they didn't want to go there, they're going to have no power. And so they gave disproportionate power to the smaller states, and that has become a real problem over time. With respect to the Warren Court, I think what the Warren Court did was to apply a totally principled and correct understanding of how the Constitution should be interpreted. Building on what Madison and Jefferson understood at the time, they recognized that democracy is maybe the best system, but that it has serious problems with it. One of them is that majorities who control the democracy often will be either indifferent to or hostile to the interests of the other, including women. And the second is that they will manipulate the political process, the electoral process, in order to retain their power. And so what the Warren Court did is basically recognize that those are the two concerns that the Supreme Court was most fundamentally designed to address: the failures of democracy along those two dimensions. And that was basically the record of the Warren Court. I mean, they were activists only in those two respects. And they made major changes in the world, beginning with Brown v. Board of Education, and extending well beyond that. But I think you're right. Now we have a Supreme Court that's the exact antithesis of that. And one other point I want to make is that the way we went from the period of Roe, by the way, I was a law clerk at the Supreme Court the year Roe v. Wade was decided, but the way we went from Roe v. Wade, when it was not a controversial decision at the time, frankly, to the present, was that conservatives recognized that they could use this issue as a way to motivate certain parts of the society, particularly Catholics, who had traditionally been Democrats, and to bring them over to the Republican Party by taking a very strong anti-abortion position, which had not been, by the way, the Republican position before Roe. And they have done that. And then, of course, things like gay rights and women's rights and sexual expression have strongly energized that group of our society. And they've become single issue voters. And the problem we have is lots of people agree with us about abortion should be legal and so on, but they don't really do anything about it. We're not seeing the equivalent of a civil rights movement or an anti-Vietnam War movement. We're seeing people take polls, that's all. But we need to do a lot more and a lot more aggressive things to change all of these issues.
So we only have a few minutes left. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One was about an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in some of these cases. A lot of the people we were talking about were Jewish. There's also a general question about whether the left can take over free speech again. after the rise of counter-revolutionary fascist movement, what would a left free speech strategy look like today? We also have somebody who would like to have a shout out to Fred Korematsu, the complex the definition of patriotism. So we have a lot of discouragement here in terms of the structural bias in favor of the minority on the Supreme Court. And as you were saying, Jeff, the Article 5 prevents us from amending the Senate. You cannot do it. You're not allowed. So there are a lot of brick walls that we're running up against. So in our last 5 minutes, can we maybe go in the order in which we spoke here? And what optimism would you see for the future? Can we take back the free speech movement, or whatever you would like to say? If you'd like to answer one of the other questions or just have a thought of your own. So final thoughts. Ellen, first you. Final thought.
Yeah, I'm not, I always thought of myself as an optimist, but it's been challenging to be an optimist in recent years. I would say that Jeff's point about the question of free speech, so long as it, the masses case, free speech, so long as it doesn't undermine democracy or the stability of the state, is, I think, the approach that we need to take now to advance freedom of speech moving forward. But I don't think, I think big lies present a real challenge to civil libertarians, and defining a jurisprudence that will distinguish a big lie that is acceptable from one that really has the potential to undermine our democracy is at the core of where legal scholars need to think, and where we as a people need to go. I guess I would say that I'm a little bit optimistic that possibly, if by some stroke of good fortune, we ever regain both houses, we could legislate some perhaps term limits on Supreme Court justices, because that's really, I think, where we face the biggest challenge in moving forward as a progressive society. We probably can't pack the court. That's a more complicated, I gather, knowing a little bit about the history of 30s, a more complicated approach, but term limits might be one way we could move forward.
Lara?
I think a lot of our discussion has sort of centered around the abuse of state power. I think, unfortunately, that's something that we see, in terms of thinking about free speech and World War I. And, if we kind of, I guess other people are going forward, since I'm a historian, I'll go backwards, which is that, the Bill of Rights was really designed to limit the power of the federal government. But, those 10 amendments don't just sit there. It's like, what matters, I think, is how people mobilize to make them meaningful. And I think, we can think of, to me, a negative example, which is all the discussion of the Second Amendment and the ways in which that's created so much mobilization that to me is certainly excessive. But I think that speaks to the fact that there really has to be political organizing for these rights to be meaningful.
So Jeff, I'd like to invite you to say whatever you want, but one question that occurs to me, which as the author of the Chicago Principles, if you'd like to address, can free speech save us, or are the American people moving away from the idea that free speech really is a fundamental value in this in the face of cancel culture on both sides?
So first, let me make a point about the prior discussion here, which is that I think the only way that those of us who are liberal can hope to preserve the values we care about in our society is by looking to what the people we've been talking about this evening did in the Lower East Side. They were willing to take bold action, to run the risk of going to prison, to create a movement that eventually took hold. And what I tell my students about the present moment is that if they care about their futures, their children's futures, and their grandchildren's futures, they've got to get off their ass and get out there and be effective at trying to change things, exactly the way the conservatives did over the last 50 years. And so the question that you asked, can you say it again, Susan? The question you asked me to address, I'm sorry, Susan.
Okay, about, do Americans still believe in free speech? The polls are slipping. You know, people on each side of the political aisle are saying, well, you know, you can say what you want, but you can't say that.
Right. Well, I think it's important to understand that we now live in a society with a extraordinarily aggressive protection of free speech, much more so than ever in our history or any place else in the world. And in order to make that possible, people have to understand that the proper response to speech you don't like is not violence. It is responding and answering and arguing the other side. And I do think we need to embed that in our educational process from kindergarten all the way through graduate schools. We need for social media platforms and newspapers and magazines to be talking about that. I think Americans have become much too passive in this regard. And you're right that the cancel culture issue is problematic because, and I think a lot of that is due to social media. It used to be that if you said something that pissed somebody else off, they'd be angry and that would be the end of it. Now they can put it on social media and tens of thousands of other people can see what they said you said. And whether it's, you know, future dates or future employers, it can have a real effect on you. And so students have become much more cautious about expressing their honest feelings because the penalty they pay for that is potentially much greater than it was 20 years ago. And they're very aware of that. And that's something we have to figure out as well.
Well, thanks. Well, Amy, would you like to say anything in wrapping up?
I do.
Or Juan?
I wanted to thank you all very much to all our participants. Thanks everyone else for joining us. We will be making the recording of tonight's panel available and circulating it in the coming days. And we hope that you'll join us again soon. Check out our event calendar where you'll find a description of the panel on reproductive rights that I mentioned before, as well as the rest of our lineup for the next month. And with that, I want to wish you all a good night. Thank you.
Thank you all and good night.
Thanks.